Greetings and welcome to Lecture 2, Leading Strategically, Aligning Vision, Mission, and Values. First, before I get too much further, I want to acknowledge that I've been inspired and motivated, I guess that's actually both the same word, by your reflection papers and also the amount of work that you all, many of you have done on discussion items. And so I want to acknowledge that, and hopefully if you feel like you need more feedback from me, definitely feel free to ask. And similarly, I just wanted to kind of, again, note that for some of you, I didn't give a grade to your assignments because I have yet to receive the second part, which was your sharing with me what would make this course worthwhile and what your contribution would be to make sure that we get there. So thank you for that. I'll be looking forward to that. And we will make some changes along the way as well around when assignments are due. And so the mission statement will be due at the end of Sunday. And I think that's the only thing, in addition to being able to make sure that you do the reading and participate in the forum, discussion forum, assigned questions. So I want to share that a lot of the work that I'm about to present has come from my years of teaching. I don't know if I actually shared, I didn't share probably in the first class, that I have a doctorate in organizational psychology. I got it in '98, and I've been playing professor ever since. And off and on, in some ways core faculty in a lot of different places, but also adjunct mostly as I've been doing my consulting practice. And this work in particular comes from my consulting practice with a group called LeaderSpring, leaderspring.org, where I ran a fellowship program for nonprofit executive directors. They would hang out with me for 2 years, 15 at a time. But also I oversaw the statewide consulting practice. And so this is where a lot of that work comes from, my experience anyway, as I brought that to the work. So I wanted to share, though, that this particular topic, leading strategically, really requires that we think about the various functions of leadership. And I love this quote from Ralph Nader, where he says that functional leadership is to develop more leaders, not more followers. And in Good to Great by Jim Collins, he identifies the level 5 leader and management team as opposed to the level 4 leader and management team, where the level 5 leader is one who leads by passion and humility, and then finds the right folks and figures out what they will all do together as a team to lead and manage their organizational work. Where the level 4 leader is often identified as a genius who says, hey, these are my strengths, and I'm going to surround myself with those who can complement my strengths and in some ways make up for my weaknesses or challenges. And so it's often a plug-and-play kind of thing. And what Collins says that in his research, moving from good to great organizations really start with first who, then what, as opposed to first what will folks do and then who do we need to fill it. So I wanted to name that as a lens from which to think about leadership, because many of you did think about in your reflection papers the idea of creating a strategic plan first and then figure out who could be there to complement you if you're the leader. But oftentimes it really is to complement you as a person, assuming that you're all complete, and then being able to plug people into their most appropriate strengths, which is what I think is so valuable about the Strengths Finder that all of you have done through Joy's class. The other thing I want to point out is this idea of, for me, that leadership complements management, it doesn't replace it. And there's a lot of work around the differences between leadership and management. My favorite of those is John Cotter's article on what leaders really do, where he says that leadership is really about setting direction, aligning resources and people, and then motivating people. And that managing is planning and budgeting, organizing and staffing, and controlling complexity and problem solving. And again, the idea that leadership complements management, it doesn't replace it. So even as you're developing your competencies through this leadership studies program, I hope you also get that you are strengthening your competencies around management as well, that you can't simply be a leader if you don't have good management skills. I wanted to also offer, however, this idea of governance, right? So in many organizations, they will have a board of directors or a board of governors or trustees. And while the CEO will be responsible for many of those things, governance, leadership, and management, the board will be responsible mostly for governance and leadership, where in governance they're clarifying priorities, principles, and values. They're establishing policies and procedures, and then they're determining levels of authority and accountability. But they're not really doing so much of the budgeting. Really, they'll be approving budgets, approving the organization design, but they only have one employee. The best models only have one employee, and that's the CEO or executive director. So I wanted to name this as a framework from which I draw to do my work around leadership and management, especially in a lot of my work around board of directors. And even when we talk about strategic planning, I do think, and I'm going to talk about power again at the end, but I do think really what we're talking about is the capability and opportunity to fulfill or obstruct the satisfaction of personal, relational, and collective needs. And in this case, we're really talking about the personal, relational, and organizational needs. And in order to understand power, we need to understand power, I think, from the macro to the micro, as well as back micro to the macro. When I talk about macro, I'm really talking about structural power. And what I mean by that is being able to have access to both opportunity and to authority. Opportunity meaning that the access to be able to say, who gets to do what? I get to get training, I get to get development, I get to go to these conferences, I get to interact with decision makers. And then the other structural power piece is that of authority. I actually have the authority to make allocation of resources. Who gets to go where? How much money we'll put in certain programming? How much staff do we get to have? And again, we need to understand that I think the structural power piece is really important. And I think actually it's that more important than oftentimes the social power, which is relational, focusing on intra and inter. Many leadership development programs that I've found that really focus on this. Like how do we have folks get along with other managers and other leaders, as well as that's intra. And then inter, how do we get along with the people that they supervise or the people to whom they supervise? That's inter. But also relational being departmental, organization to organization, communities to communities. So when we think about research, sales, marketing, and development, right? How do they all work together in a social power element? And then most programs, more often than not, really focus primarily on the personal power, really developing their ability to make change, right? So what we're talking about there is competencies, what they know, what they're able to do, what they have the capacity for, and what they might be motivated to do, which is what volition is, right? The idea that they have choice. So it's not enough to just use your power if you have the abilities, but you actually have to choose to use it or not use it. And again, I want to bring our attention back up to the definition of power, that for me, power isn't good or bad, it just is. It's the use of power that could be good or bad, because we can use our power to fulfill or obstruct the satisfaction of personal, relational, and collective needs. In a couple weeks, I'll talk more about understanding systems of oppression, in particular, how I think capitalism and racism and sexism and many other issues of oppression also influence the way we understand ourselves in our culture and in our interactions. This particular lecture, I wanted to suggest that when we're talking about leading strategically, we're actually responding to a call. And I think the call of a leader in the organization is based on one's vision, mission, and values. So here's a brief definition of vision, mission, and values. And in this lecture, I'm going to take you through a little bit of a process to identify your personal mission statement, but you also can use the same process when you think about an organizational mission statement, and also how it's related very much so to the values. We're not going to talk about vision yet. We're going to talk about vision more so a little bit at the end of this lecture, but more so when we get to identifying and managing strategic issues. I wanted to flash for you an example of the organization where I used to work, what our vision was, right? And it was that of leaders, organizations, communities in the social sector achieve their promise and potential to create a healthy and equitable society. And you notice in the mission statement there are 3 bullets. It's interesting, the third bullet, transforming the systems in which they work, was added sometime later, in that for the longest time we were strengthening leaders and organizations, developing communities of leaders. And then one of the criticisms of our programming was that we were helping leaders become effective in a dysfunctional system. And so it was then that we realized that we needed to add that third bullet to help our leaders work in it and on it simultaneously, right? Be effective yet transform and change the organizational systems, the social sector. And then you can see there on the right the values from which we drew our work and were guided by. When I talk about values, I think it's important one way to think about values is to think about needs. So what I'd like you to do, and again, I'm going through this quickly, but at some point, in order for you to work on your mission statement, I would encourage you to review this list and reflect on one that really resonates strongly for you. And then I would encourage you to pick a need and spend a minute or so to experience each of the following. Remember a moment when that need was not met for you. And as you focus on remembering this moment, notice any body sensations within you. What feelings arise in you. And simply be with this feeling and need for a minute. Now what I'd like you to do is imagine this need being richly, completely fulfilled for you. And then spend about a minute or so experiencing each of the following. What are you imagining would be happening as that need is being met richly and completely? Notice any body sensations within you and what feelings arise in you. Then simply be with this feeling and need for a few minutes. And as you think about that, what request might you make of yourself that will contribute toward this need being fulfilled in your life? What I just took you through, if you kind of listen through choosing one word, it's in some ways understanding what you're facing on a regular basis. And in some ways, creating a vision is about avoiding the need or value not being met and fulfilling the need and value. So you'll hear from me later that one of my values is community. Another need. Another one is love. And I think even through that, one of the things that I am so about is that of equity and resilience and perseverance, but especially commitment and purpose. So you will hear how that shows up in my mission statement in a moment. But I think one of the things to sit with is be able to think about what is a resonating or emerging value for you. And then again, you can do the same thing for the organization. When you think about an organization, what is it like when a value or need isn't met in that organization? What are the interactions like? And then what are the interactions like when it's richly and completely filled? And as you think about those values, that moment, sometimes it's a matter of being able to declare it, right? So there are conditions that you can cultivate. And drawing from Gandhi's quote, I also think your own assessment of your capacity and will is critical. And it really comes from knowing what your needs and values are. And that requires naming what lies at the heart of you and your work. So again, if you need to pause this, do so, and take a moment to capture this for yourself. What lies at the heart of you and your work? When I think about a mission statement, and when I think about especially working with an organization, or even my own personal, I think it's a lot like writing a dating profile. And this is one from OkCupid where they ask, what am I doing with my life? What am I really good at? What's the first thing that people usually notice about me? When you think about your organization, you or your organization. What does your organization spend a lot of time thinking about? Or what do you spend a lot of time thinking about? On a typical Friday night, I am what? You're looking for what if you want to be a match? Your organization or you personally want to be a match for something. What are you looking for? And then others should message your organization of what? Right? This would be a fun activity, not only just for cultivating your mission statement and organization's mission, but even cultivating work towards branding. But for now, what I'd like you to do, again, is pause and really capture some things that you're really, really good at. But even more at the heart of what you're good at, and even sometimes values, it's really identifying what matters for you. I mentioned this one at the beginning of the first lecture last week. And again, I'd like you to take a moment to be able to capture for whom and what do you have love and gratitude, and for whom and what do you have compassion and commitment. I know for me, I have a lot of love and gratitude for my sons, parents, brothers. I'm grateful to have a doctorate, a career. I'm actually even grateful for my successes and failures, for persevering through a brain tumor that I had in 2010, a liver disease that I just learned that I have a couple of weeks ago, asthma as a child. I'm deaf in my left ear, but also knowing that I'm really compassionate and committed to those who are most in need. I'm committed to working with leaders and organizations, in particular serving low-income communities and communities of color. And there are those who I realize don't have access to opportunities and power like I might, and that's for whom I'm trying to transform our communities. So again, take a moment to just capture these for you. I invite you to do so. And I know we all are different places, and if you are someone, if you don't feel like you have someone to love or have gratitude for or have compassion and commitment for something, you can borrow some of the things that I shared. Borrow some of mine while we identify yours through the course, right? So take a moment to do that. Pause this and do that. So for me, creating a mission statement is really as simply as plug and play. What I'd like you to do is take those, 3 of those most awesome verbs that you captured when you wrote what you're really good at. And maybe think about those 3 things that you're super duper awesome at, right? And then take that phrase or that line or what lies at the heart of you in your work and put it in that second line. And then for what and or whom you have compassion and commitment, put it in that bottom line. So for example, my mission is to facilitate, integrate, and cultivate a love-based social justice agenda for community well-being. And so again, 3 things that I'm really good at is facilitating, integrating, and cultivating. What lies at the heart of me and my work is a love-based social justice agenda, and for whom and what I have compassion and commitment is community well-being, especially low-income communities and communities of color. Right? So play around and see what you come up with, and that's what's due at the end of this week. Right? And if you actually have an organization that you want to work with or a team that you want to work with, you can do the same activity with them. Right? I wanted to note that when we actually do our strategic planning and our mission and vision and values work, there's this notion of situatedness, and that we need to acknowledge, and I talked about a lot of the ways that we understand organizations in the first lecture, but I want us to acknowledge that our interests are situational, and sometimes their tensions are going to emerge, and they're not always personal, sometimes they're structural. And so the work is often being harder on the structure and softer on the people. And so when we think about what are the highest strategic priorities, we may have some common goals, but because we're differently situated, we may be in sharp contrast, meaning because we have in our organization some common goals, the researchers have a different perspective than the programmers. The CEO and the executive team have a different perspective than the frontline staff. The board of directors are differently situated than the constituents, right? And so what are the solutions? We can either be transactional or transformational. And so I'll just share that part of the work that I do, and I'm going to talk more about my values around that later, is moving more towards something transformational. I want to take a moment now, and I realize that I'm already going longer than I wanted to, and give you a concept around strategic thinking. I got this from my son who's a chess master. When he was 7, he used to beat me regularly at chess. And I'm talking through this quickly because, again, I don't want to go too long, but he used to beat me regularly, and I asked him when he was 7, how are you able to beat me so regularly? And he said, because I wasn't thinking strategically. So here I was, already had a doctorate in organizational psychology, and he was telling me that I wasn't thinking strategically. So I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he would say this, you need to think about leverage, sequence, and linkage. And leverage is being able to know what most priority, he said in chess, is being able to control the center of the board. The sequence is sometimes you need to make sure you move out certain pawns in order to let the other pieces move out. But in terms of linkage, it's not always about controlling the center of the board by being at the center of the board. Sometimes it means being able to have your bishop control the diagonal and your knights, control the sides so that other pieces can control the middle, and being able to know how the whole board has to be considered, right? And then the other thing around developing strategically is being able to know what's urgent and not urgent, as well as not important and not urgent. I'm not going to go so much into this now, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when we start against identifying some strategic issues. But I wanted to share this great kind of notion about success, that sometimes when we identify goals, we think what people think it looks like is this, right? You read something, you have an idea, you network a little, and then you have overnight success when you achieve that goal. But we know even with a good strategic plan, it looks a little bit more messier than that, right? There's going to be a number of failures that happen along the way. So I don't want to suggest by any means that simply because we develop a strategic plan and do some incredible forecasting, it's not going to be a straight line. It's not going to be smooth. I want to offer this graphic. There's a lot of folks who use acronym SMART to be able to do goals. I add the ER because my work is around being equity-centered and relationship-oriented. So I would add those to the acronym. I'm going to do more about this later, but I wanted to say that as you enter into understanding a SWOT analysis, it really is about being able to know what our capabilities are, right? Being able to know where, when, and how would we progress, and how would progress be experienced, in what various ways, and who would be experiencing it, and what are the capabilities that are required, right? What human, financial, and technological capabilities are required for creating and progressing on the goals. Sometimes when we create a strategic plan, we're actually creating a different organizational structure, and the implication is that sometimes that means a whole layer of staff will be eliminated, or you need to figure out how to develop them for the next organizational structure, right? So something to think about. This is how I think action plan happens. It actually starts with beginning with the end in mind, right? So what are the results you're looking for? And then what are the necessary conditions that'll get you those results? And what are the actions that you need to take to actually get those conditions? So once you kind of starting again with the end in mind, with the results and the necessary conditions, then you think about what are the actions that'll get there, and then you test it. If we do this, then we'll get this, so that will result in this. So this is the work that I'm doing now with my organization, East Oakland Building Healthy Communities. We have a belief that if we do capacity building and change making with residents and youth, as well as policymakers, and that if we work towards policy and systems change where we demand and win systems, and work with system leaders to influence implementation of these wins, and that our systems leaders can respond to pressure from our constituents, then we'll get some environmental change. We'll increase housing stability in East Oakland. Our neighborhoods and homes will be more environmentally safe. We'll have fresh food that is easily accessible in the neighborhoods. And East Oakland neighborhoods have safe and accessible public transportation, so that the health status change will be one where we increase in mental and physical wellness, decrease in infectious disease, chronic disease and injury, decrease in mental illness and substance abuse, and decrease in deaths. So this is just another graphic of that theory of change, but with more of the words that I just shared, right? So again, just an example. So action planning, strategic action planning, is again being able to say what are the things we're going to do and what are the resources we're going to need. So this sounds a little bit like the input, throughput, output that I shared in the first lecture, right? What are the effects that we think will happen as a result of those efforts, right? Conditions, the change in competence, the benchmarks, how we know we're making progress, and then what are the new habits of heart, mind, and body? What are our actual achievements as a result of our implementation of our plan, right? So as I bring it to a close, I want to say that the other thing that I think about quite importantly, significantly, is that the dimensions of interactions between three things. And that's process, which is how will the work get done, how the work is designed and managed, and how the work is monitored and evaluated, right? Relationships, how the people will experience each other, how we will equitably be involved and contribute. And then results, right? What will we achieve by when, and what is the quality of the results being met? But for me, what really brings it around my principles and values, especially those of equity and social justice, when I'm talking about process, I'm talking about power. Right? When I'm talking about relationships, I'm talking about love. And when I'm talking about results, I'm talking about justice. Right? And I use that frame in particular because I'm really inspired by Martin Luther King, who talks about social change quite a bit. And one of his quotes where he says, we often think of power and love as polar opposites, when in fact, power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And so for me, when I think about all of these things, I often think about them simultaneously and doing the work simultaneously when we're doing a strategic planning process. But I get, for some though, it's about doing it sequentially. But which one do we start with? Knowing the results, knowing the process, being in a relationship. Well, for me, it gets back to, again, my value and principles around purpose. My son's name is Mahal, and Mahal in Tagalog means love, and it means expensive, and he's both. Right? And I remember when he was 4, he used to tell me, he would sit up really close to me, and I'd say, Mahal, why are you sitting so close to me? And he would say, because I love you. Right? And sometimes at dinner time, he would give me his vegetables, and I would say, Mahal, why are you giving me your vegetables? And he would say, because I love you. And then I'd go to his room and I'd say, Mahal, why is your room such a mess? And he would say, because I love you. And so when we're talking about social change and organizational development and strategic planning and process and forecasting, I think it does come down to purpose. And if you don't spend some time knowing your purpose and knowing the organization's purpose, then you're not really going to be clear as to what you're working on. And so if you are unclear about your purpose, what I recommend is take it from my son Mahal and let your purpose be love. So thank you for this, and sorry again that it went a little bit longer than I intended, but I'll work on getting it shorter next time. Thank you.